The screaming corridor, doorway to hell. The house stood at the end of Black Hollow Road, shrouded in mist, its silhouette jagged against the moonlit sky. No one in town dared to step near it, not since the disappearances. The windows, black and soulless, seemed to watch, waiting for the next victim. Eleanor Grayson had always been drawn to abandoned places, fascinated by their history. A writer specializing in supernatural investigations, she had spent years seeking out the most haunted locations in America. The moment she heard about the Black Hollow house, known by the locals as the Screaming Corridor, she knew she had to see it for herself. The legend was chilling. People who entered the house claimed to hear screams coming from deep within its halls, cries of agony that were neither human nor animal. Some said the walls bled, that shadows moved even when there was no light. And those who stayed too long were never seen again. Eleanor pulled up to the house just past midnight, the air heavy with a strange, suffocating stillness. The trees surrounding the property were gnarled, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. The iron gate screeched as she pushed it open, a sound that sent an unnatural chill down her spine. She gripped her flashlight tightly, stepping onto the overgrown pathway leading to the front door. The house loomed over her, its rotting wooden exterior pulsing with something alive. The moment she touched the doorknob, a violent gust of wind roared through the trees, making the air howl like a wounded animal. She hesitated. Something about this place felt wrong. Still, she was here for a reason. If she could document the truth behind the legend, it would be the story of a lifetime. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob. The door creaked open on its own. The darkness inside was absolute. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but beneath that was something else. Something foul, like rotting flesh. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the house were swallowing the sound. The first room was empty, save for an old, dust-covered chair in the center. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as though something had clawed at them in desperation. Then she heard it. A faint, distant whisper. It came from deep within the house, somewhere down the corridor. Her flashlight flickered, and for the briefest moment she saw something in the reflection of a broken mirror. Something standing behind her. Something grinning. Then the whisper turned into a scream. A blood-curdling, inhuman wail that echoed through the house, shaking the very floor beneath her feet. Eleanor spun around. The front door was gone. The house had sealed her inside. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat as she stared at the empty space where the door had been. Her flashlight flickered again, casting wild shadows across the rotting walls. Cold sweat trickled down her back. She turned in slow circles, scanning the room. No exit, no windows, only the corridor ahead. The scream had come from somewhere deep within the house, echoing down that endless black hallway. The air in the house felt heavier now, thick with something unseen, something watching. A sudden thump came from behind her. She whirled around, heart pounding. The chair in the center of the room had moved. It was facing her now. She swallowed hard, stepping backward toward the corridor. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to claw at the walls, to do anything but go deeper into the house. But she had come here for answers, and something inside her, some morbid curiosity or reckless bravery, pushed her forward. With each step, the corridor seemed to stretch, the walls narrowing, pressing in. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, revealing something dark beneath. It wasn't wood or brick. It was pulsing, like flesh. The floorboards creaked under her weight, groaning like something ancient and hungry. The deeper she went, the stronger the smell of rot became, thick and suffocating. She covered her nose, gagging. Then she heard the whisper again. It was right behind her. A breath, cold as death, brushed against her ear. "You're not supposed to be here." Eleanor screamed, spinning around. Nothing. Her flashlight caught movement in the corner of her eye, something scuttling along the ceiling, too fast to see clearly. Her pulse pounded against her skull. She kept moving. Further down the corridor, the walls trembled as if they were breathing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, 1,000 voices speaking in agony. Eleanor pressed her hands against her ears, but they wormed into her mind, their voices twisting into something intelligible. "We see you. We hear you. You will never leave." The words dug into her brain like claws, and then she saw it. At the end of the corridor stood a doorway, just a dark, gaping entrance into the unknown. The screams came from within, a sound so raw and full of suffering that it made her stomach twist. A figure stood just beyond the threshold. Tall, motionless, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It had no eyes, no face, only a gaping, jagged mouth that stretched impossibly wide. Eleanor stumbled back, heart hammering. The thing took a single step forward, its bones cracking like breaking twigs. The walls pulsed violently. Something grabbed her ankle. She looked down, rotting hands emerging from the floor, skeletal fingers clutching her flesh. She screamed, kicking them off, scrambling backward. The figure in the doorway let out a sound, a low, guttural chuckle. The corridor began to collapse. The walls folded inward, the ceiling cracked, and darkness poured toward her like a living thing. Eleanor turned and ran. But no matter how fast she moved, the corridor stretched endlessly. The exit was gone. The house was swallowing her whole. Eleanor ran. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, shifting, warping, refusing to let her escape. The walls convulsed, their rotting surface peeling away to reveal something wet and alive underneath. The house was no longer just a building. It was breathing. Behind her, the thing in the doorway was following. Its footsteps were slow, deliberate, the sound of bones grinding against each other. It did not rush because it knew she could not escape. Eleanor's lungs burned as she sprinted forward, but the corridor had no end. It twisted and turned like a labyrinth, the walls shuddering with each step she took. The whispers grew louder, blending into an unbearable chorus of agony. "Stay with us. Feed the house. You belong to it now." She clutched her head, her vision blurring as the voices wormed their way deeper into her mind. Her flashlight flickered violently. Shadows crawled across the ceiling, contorting into nightmarish shapes. Then, a door. It appeared out of nowhere, old and splintered, standing slightly ajar. Without thinking, Eleanor lunged for it, pushing it open and stumbling inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. Silence. She was in a room, a small, dimly lit study lined with ancient bookshelves. Dust covered every surface. A single candle flickered on an old wooden desk, its flame barely illuminating the gloom. For the first time since stepping into the house, the whispers were gone. Eleanor sucked in a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She turned toward the desk, her eyes landing on something strange. An old leather-bound journal, its cover worn and brittle. She picked it up. The names scrawled on the first page sent ice through her veins. Jonathan Reed. She knew that name. He was the last person who had entered this house before vanishing without a trace. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. The ink was smudged, the words frenzied. The farther she read, the more dread pooled in her stomach. The house is alive. It feeds on fear, on pain. It twists reality, keeping its victims trapped within the corridor, breaking their minds until they are nothing but echoes. I see them now, the others, those who came before me. They are part of the house. It will take me soon too. God help anyone who enters after me. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The last page was splattered with something dark, something red. Then a noise, a slow, wet scraping sound. Her body went rigid. Something was behind her. She turned her head, just enough to see the reflection in the dusty glass of the bookshelf. A figure loomed over her, tall, twisted, its face split open in a grotesque, gaping maw. Jonathan Reed, or what was left of him. Eleanor spun around just as the thing let out a horrific, gurgling scream. The candle blew out, darkness swallowed the room, and the house began to feed. Darkness consumed everything. Eleanor's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the desk. The room was black, utterly devoid of light. The only sound was the sickening, wet gurgling of the thing that had once been Jonathan Reed. Then, footsteps. Slow, shuffling movements like something dragging itself across the floor. The air reeked of decay, thick and putrid. Eleanor clutched the journal to her chest, her pulse hammering against her ribs. A whisper slithered through the darkness. "Stay with us." She felt it move closer. Then, a cold hand clamped onto her wrist. Eleanor screamed, yanking herself free. Her flashlight, useless before, sputtered back to life just as she stumbled backward. The beam landed on the thing in front of her. It was no longer human. Jonathan Reed's face had stretched into something grotesque, his skin loose and sagging as if it had melted. His eyes were sunken pits of blackness, his mouth a jagged, gaping hole lined with too many teeth. His fingers had elongated, bony claws dripping with something dark, and his body, his torso was splitting open down the center, ribs bending outward like an unholy maw. He took a staggering step forward. Eleanor didn't think. She ran. She slammed into the door, yanking it open, and nearly fell into the corridor. The walls trembled as if in rage, the whispers surging into a frenzied, ear-splitting scream. The corridor had changed. The walls were bleeding now, thick rivulets of black liquid seeping through cracks in the wallpaper. The ceiling sagged, dripping with something pulsing. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, as if something alive moved beneath them. A sound rose behind her, the horrible, wet tearing of flesh. She turned. Jonathan Reed was crawling toward her, his body twisting unnaturally, his ribs splitting open further to reveal writhing, grasping hands inside his chest cavity. "Feed the house," he gurgled, his voice layered with others. The corridor began to close in, the walls folded inward, pressing closer, forcing her to move forward. Eleanor bolted, dodging jagged wooden beams that jutted out like ribs. The deeper she went, the more the corridor warped. The floor bulged beneath her, the wood splitting open. Something rose from the cracks, dozens of rotting, grasping hands clawing at her ankles. She kicked, stumbled, fought to break free. Then she saw it, another door. It was different from the others. Old, rusted metal, covered in symbols carved deep to its surface. Unlike everything else in the house, it didn't pulse, it didn't feel alive. Eleanor threw herself toward it. Just as Jonathan lunged, his claws raked across her back, ripping through fabric and skin. Eleanor screamed, pain lancing through her as hot blood spilled down her spine, but she didn't stop. With every ounce of strength, she slammed into the door, forcing it open. The moment she crossed the threshold, the corridor collapsed behind her, swallowing Jonathan's shriek in an explosion of darkness. Then, silence. Eleanor collapsed onto the cold floor, panting, body trembling. The pain in her back throbbed, but she was alive. Slowly, she looked up. She was no longer in the house. Not in a way that made sense. The room before her was massive, an ancient cathedral-like space filled with towering monoliths of flesh pulsating and shifting. The ceiling was impossibly high, the walls lined with skeletal figures embedded in the stone, their hollow eyes watching. And at the center of it all, a throne of bone and sinew, and something sitting upon it. Something vast, something inhuman. The house had led her here, to the thing that controlled it, to the heart of the horror. Eleanor's body trembled as she forced herself to stand. Her back throbbed from the deep claw marks Jonathan had left in her flesh. But the pain was nothing compared to the suffocating dread that filled the massive chamber before her. The walls breathed, slick with pulsing veins that ran through the stone like a circulatory system. The skeletal figures embedded in the walls shifted, their hollow eyes following her every movement. And at the center of it all, the thing on the throne waited. It was massive, its form impossibly tall and twisted, its flesh shifting like an ever-changing nightmare. It had no defined shape, but its many mouths, gaping, grinning, filled with jagged teeth, stretched across its body. Long, bony arms jutted from its sides, each ending in clawed fingers that twitched, eager to grasp, to tear, to consume. But the worst part, its eyes. Not two, but dozens, scattered across its shifting flesh, all of them fixated on her. Eleanor's breath came in short gasps. She had seen horrors before, paranormal entities, spirits, but this was something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. It had been waiting for her. The air around her thickened, pressing against her skin, against her lungs. A voice echoed inside her skull, not spoken aloud, but embedded directly into her mind. "You have come far." The voice was not one, but many, layered whispers, screams, guttural growls, all speaking in unison. The walls trembled at its presence. Eleanor's knees buckled, but she fought to stay upright. "What are you?" she forced out, her voice barely above a whisper. The entity's mouths twisted into something resembling a grin. "I am hunger. I am the corridors. I am the house. I am the whispers in the dark. The fear in your bones. I am the screaming." A grotesque laughter echoed through the chamber, rising in intensity, warping into a wail of agony and madness. The skeletal figures in the walls began to move, their bodies convulsing, their mouths stretching open in silent screams. Eleanor staggered backward, her mind spinning. The thing on the throne leaned forward, its massive form unfolding, its many arms reaching out toward her. "You were chosen, Eleanor Grayson." Her blood ran cold. To be the next offering. The chamber shook violently, the walls splitting open to reveal more flesh, more writhing hands. From the shadows, figures emerged, the twisted, rotting remnants of those the house had devoured. Jonathan Reed was among them, his mouth distended into a never-ending scream, his body contorted into something unnatural. Eleanor turned to run, but the door was gone. A laugh, low and insidious, rattled the very air around her. "You cannot leave. The house is alive, and it is hungry." The walls began to close in, the skeletal figures reaching for her, their bony fingers grasping at her hair, her arms, her throat. The ground beneath her split open, revealing a void of endless writhing mouths waiting to consume her whole. Eleanor screamed. The last thing she saw was the entity's grinning mouths, its many eyes watching with sickening delight as the house swallowed her alive. Eleanor was falling. She plunged into the gaping maw of the house, a tunnel of writhing flesh, bone, and screaming mouths. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the stench of rot and decay. Hands, endless, grasping hands, tore at her clothing, her skin, her hair. Some were human, others grotesque mutations with too many fingers, too many joints. She screamed, but her voice was stolen. The moment the sound left her lips, the walls of flesh absorbed it, feeding it into the chorus of endless tormented wails that surrounded her. She was not the first to fall, and she would not be the last. The tunnel twisted violently, slamming her against pulsating, wet walls as it spat her out into the abyss below. She crashed onto something soft and slick. Not ground. Flesh. Eleanor gagged, pushing herself up, only to realize she was lying on a field of writhing bodies, their faces frozen in silent agony, their mouths stretched open in endless, soundless screams, the stolen voices of the damned. She scrambled back, but the ground itself pulsed beneath her, shifting as though alive. And then they moved. The figures twitched, their heads snapping toward her, empty black holes where their eyes should have been. She was not alone. A sickening, wet, tearing sound filled the air. Something rose from the mass of bodies, a monstrous, crawling thing, its limbs twisted, its face a grotesque patchwork of human mouths, all moving, all whispering in unison. "Join us. Feed the house," Eleanor screamed, scrambling to her feet as the thing lurched toward her, dragging itself on two long arms. Her heart pounded. There had to be a way out. But there was only darkness stretching endlessly, the ground shifting beneath her, pulling her down, trying to consume her. She ran. The thing chased her, its many mouths laughing, crying, screaming, all at once. She ran through corridors of living flesh, past faces embedded in the walls, their hands reaching, begging for release. She ran past twisted figures, their bodies broken, fused into the very structure of the house. She ran even as the whispers became voices she knew. Her mother, her father, her friends, all calling to her, their voices distorted, warped. She clenched her teeth, pushing forward, refusing to listen. Then, a door. It stood impossibly out of place, an old wooden door like the one she had first entered through. It was the only thing in this hell that did not breathe, did not move. A way out. Behind her, the thing shrieked, lunging toward her with its many arms, its mouth stretching open in unnatural grins. Eleanor threw herself at the door, gripping the handle. It turned. Light exploded around her as she yanked it open, the screams of the house surging into a deafening, wretched howl. She fell through the threshold, and everything went black. Eleanor awoke, gasping for air. She was no longer in the abyss, no longer drowning in the endless sea of flesh and voices. She was back in the house. The old, rotting hallway stretched before her, just as she had first seen it. The flickering light bulb above, the peeling wallpaper, the suffocating silence. Her hands trembled as she touched her arms, her face. She was whole. No wounds. No signs of the nightmare that had consumed her. For a single, fleeting moment. Relief. Then she heard it. A whisper. Faint. Hollow. It came from everywhere, from inside the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from within her own chest. Eleanor's breath hitched. Something was wrong. She turned, moving toward the exit. The front door stood ahead, slightly ajar, moonlight spilling in through the crack. Freedom. She forced herself forward, every step heavy, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Closer. The door creaked open as she reached for it, revealing the night outside. The cold wind brushed against her skin, and for the first time in what felt like eternity, she took a deep, shuddering breath. She stepped out, and the world screamed. Eleanor froze. The sky was wrong. The moon was twisted, pulsing like a living organ, casting an unnatural red glow over the world. The houses, the streetlights, the very air itself breathed, shifting in slow, unnatural movements. And the people, they stood motionless, their backs to her. Their heads twitching, jerking at odd angles. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came out. No, that wasn't right. She could hear them. The screaming, it was coming from inside them, from their hollow, open mouths. A wave of sheer terror slammed into her. The house had not let her go. It had consumed the world. Eleanor staggered backward, shaking her head. No, this wasn't real. She turned, desperate to run, and came face to face with herself. Another Eleanor stood before her, identical in every way, same clothes, same tear-streaked face, but the other Eleanor was smiling, and when she opened her mouth, it was not a human mouth. It was a gaping, endless void, lined with rows of jagged, twitching teeth, pulsating and shifting like something not meant to exist. A voice, her own voice, but layered with 1,000 others, poured from the void. "You never left," Eleanor screamed, and this time the world screamed with her.